All right. I'm just going to make sure.
Test, test, test. Here we go. Here we go.
All right. Yeah. There we go. Why? Yeah. So we'll start in just a second. I was telling Greg, whoops, I got to change this to Tripp and Greg, you know, because you're not.
You're allowing me to be a part. Thank you.
I know. We don't need people confused. They're like
Tripp and Fuller.
It is Tripp and Fuller. And so yeah. Well, actually, this would be high quality content, Greg. So we'll just use it.
All right, let's hear it.
We'll just use it. So yeah, we've had plumbing issues. We got a house, our first house at 40 because
life.
Well, that and we lived in Los Angeles and European
Edinburgh.
capitals.
Yeah.
Not places you.
No, Edinburgh is not cheap.
Places people with philosophy degrees purchase homes. So we've had weird plumbing things and have had multiple people. Well, they've now discovered what the issue is. The pipe that goes underneath the house.
Yeah.
Ruptured.
Oh no, underneath the house.
Oh yeah. We're having some people come to see what it's going to cost to drill through the slab and repair a ruptured pipe. And
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
That's rough.
So contemplate that. Fool.
Contemplate that.
I was sitting there with this face, Elgin, the kids are getting home as I'm piecing together what the situation is. And I'm like, don't worry. Santa already went shopping for you.
That's right. Christmas gifts are secured.
I'm not going to return them.
That's funny. Yeah, well, I tell you, that I do think.
Hello, Michael.
Hey, Michael. Yeah. So the idea of contemplate that's funny, but it's also true. Like this morning, Tripp knows I just got here minutes before starting, driving quickly through the Greensboro rain and slick streets. And it is, we were laughing on the way down, just the reality of understanding the contemplative or the wisdom tradition within the craziness of life. This morning for me, it was, I've got a new puppy that, cute puppy growing like a weed and, but potty training. And so it's all sorts of, oh my gosh, does the house now smell like urine? And it probably does. And just getting, the dog's ripping down the Christmas tree. And so it's like in the middle of trying to get over here, the craziness of dogs peeing and pulling down trees and trying to, somewhat remain grounded and sane and driving quickly. But I do think that's the reality. It's again, we're not trying to create the monastic when we're not really living the monastic life. So and we're not trying to microdose the monastic into our 21st century lifestyle. So what does it look like to actually approach this with a different lens than a medieval one?
Speaking of microdosing, that was one of the questions, but we aren't going to talk about that. But I will say,
not the monastic.
No, next week, it'll be next week because I'm so far behind because I've spent a couple days without being able to use a dishwasher or a sink. Anyway, everyone to get an email with January. We're doing a whole series of live streams with all the different people and stuff that were at Theology Beer Camp.
Nice.
And we have all the keynotes edited, which include Sarah Lane Ritchie's, which talks about spiritual technologies and all that kind of stuff. She'll join one of the streams and such. I'm going to try to talk you into it. And then, so those looking for a fun conversation about
that will be a good one. That's a good one. And
chemical contributions to one's
chemicals is spiritual technology. It's worthy conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I like caffeine.
There you go. That's an example.
90s karaoke.
Yep. All three technologies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway. All three can be abused, especially karaoke.
Whoa. What
did you hear when I
I took that personal. uh, that we have a number of fun questions, and we have two that are like more nerdy, that there were a number of questions about.
Yeah.
And then do you want to do those first or the more personal ones first?
Let's start with personal, and then we'll go nerdy.
All right. So the first one, the reflection this week in the center of Advent is looking at joy, in particular the joy of a mother,
Hmm.
Mary. But in the reflection that you shared on the second breath app, and so many different Advent reflections are thinking about joy, and there are two different questions that came in from people who I don't want to give the details of their personal situation, but one of them, it was a series of family crises,
Mm.
and then the idea of joy was problematic.
Mm.
The other individual said, I have kind of muted Christmas since leaving home. This individual's in grad school now, but since going to college, I would show back up, but I didn't mess with it because I haven't dealt with most of the baggage from growing up in a angry conservative. But what does it mean to figure out joy at Christmas when so much of what you might call faith is full of uncertainty?
Yeah.
Right. So they're both for kind of emotional reasons and the trauma of relationships, and then kind of even that the wrestling and not having the kind of confidence or certainty that she grew up having around
Sure.
the big ideas of Christmas. How do spiritual practices, or how does that function as an invitation to joy in uncertainty, in struggle of pain and loss, memory of loved ones and such?
That's such a good question. I've really wrestled with this. I mean, and especially my own journey of even what does faith and trust look like, and uncertainty, especially in an open and relational universe. If we're, a God who's not omnipotent, that's a different question altogether. But one thing I think sometimes, just to name this on the outset, I think that we can almost view joy or the concept of hope as a pressure, like we ought to. Like we ought to feel joy.
Yeah.
And then we can pressure ourselves, and then we can beat ourselves up and feel shame if we don't. And so in that case, I think that's joy gone awry, or you could, just like we talked about last week, that's weaponized joy. That joy always is something that is going to be, as we cultivate it, something more magnetic, and never a spear at the back, a threat of ought to and shoulds. And I'm sure you heard it before, but we Christians, especially those recovering from more conservative backgrounds, we should all over ourselves. We have so many shoulds and oughts and things, that we feel pressure to. I would say this too: if someone's in the middle of grief, even in a grieving process, I remember there was a number of years ago, there was someone in my life who really hurt me, technicolor wounding, and I needed to for a season I needed to for a season give myself permission to be really angry with this person. And it was a part of, I wasn't trying to rush. For many years, I'd done the ought to, should, forgive, but in many ways it was like Band-Aid on a sucking chest wound. It wasn't genuinely dealing with my pain. And so I was like, I'm supposed to forgive. I forgive them. And then finally I reached a point of like, that's actually just repression and denial, with shoulding through forgiveness. And I think that we can do the same with joy. If we're trying to rush to joy, I think then it's a interwoven process of all the complexities of the journey, and that includes anger, that includes deep sadness and sorrow, and that includes acceptance. And we're not. To me, the invitation is to be fully human.
Yeah.
And joy is a part of the tapestry. The point isn't, let me get out of my hard stuff to where I ought to be as a Christian, which is joy. It's an invitation to the whole journey. That's what we talked about last week when Jesus talked about fullness of life. That gave him the capacity, excuse me, to laugh with children, but also to weep at the tomb of Lazarus. That he was able to weep with those in pain and experience laughter and joy with those that were in that space. And also, Rob Bell does a good job on this, that if you have a bookshelf with all of the human emotions, you can call the bookshelf joy. that joy encapsulates the wholeness of the human experience. It is not just the fun stuff. It's not happy. So I would just say the invitation to joy is an invitation to authentically engage the fullness of life and the fullness of the human experience. And of course, at Christmas time, and this is the beauty of the liturgical calendar,
Yeah.
it's specifically inviting us to particular things to reflect on that we might normally neglect. There's some of us that just love to think about joy all the time, and there's some of us that are prone to just think about all the stuff going wrong all the time. So there's like, for me, I tend to be minimize problems and focus on what's happy. So Lent is a good season for me because it's something I normally would ignore. And then I've got other friends who tend to spin in anxiety and sadness all the time. And so this invitation to joy, a liturgical season of an invitation, reflects specifically on these other aspects, is actually helpful and healthy for them. So I guess out of the gate, I would just, on a personal level, it's broadening the definition of joy and giving permission for the full spectrum of human emotion and experience. That's the fullness of life. Well, what do you think about that?
Well, I really like that. So here, let me say back what I think you were saying in a different way Tripp would phrase it to see if my intuitions are good. Part of what you're saying is if joy is poorly defined, then it's something that's elusive. And when you don't have this kind of narrow cotton candy version of joy, then a lot of religious traditions will be like, well, that's your fault.
Right.
You're the one to blame for not having feelings like you just had intense volumes of sugar right now. And by having that narrow definition and then putting the blame on the individual if they don't have it, it leads to patterns of self-judgment, feeling like, oh, there's obviously something wrong with me, and that kind of thing. And one of the gifts of a thicker account of joy, and one of the gifts of attending to the presence of the divine, is a recognition that joy is a disposition towards reality, not something that results from it.
Right.
That
right.
when what you engage with in the world, be it other people or the struggles of what's going on in your vocation or that kind of thing, if what you're relating to in the world and the circumstances and moments you're in aren't the place you receive joy, but joy is the disposition of relating to those people, places, challenges, and things, having your affirmation of self already given by the divine. So then joy is a disposition towards reality rather than something that results from it.
Yeah, that's a good additional nuance. Yep, I would agree with that too.
Okay. Well, no, you were going back and forth with these different images, and I thought, oh, that's helpful.
Yeah.
Like and that's better than what I would have said if I answered first. Like I was like, oh, I think I like Greg's better.
Yeah, and again, I think there's just so much pressure we put on ourselves within our Christian circles of and again, I'm repeating myself, but I think it bears repeating, of so many oughts and shoulds and forgiveness, joy, and what we do is minimize them into these, like you said, both ephemeral and like ephemerally specific, that we know we ought to feel this way and ought to forgive someone and ought to feel joy at Christmas and ought to feel gratitude for the love of God. And yet, if the reality is, if we're in the middle of profound suffering or recovering from religious trauma, or whatever that looks like, that's going to be a journey. And it's going to look very different than the cookie cutter versions of joy that we were taught most often.
So, one of the things in this, so the next question is kind of related to this, but it was an individual who sees what's on their agenda for the next few weeks and knows they're going to constantly be making a decision to tell the truth, hold their tongue, and such, because the place they came from is one where they are at best a heretic. And then what do you do when you are keeping silent or nuancing or all that kind of stuff? And most of the time, this individual said they are comfortable and enjoy where they've got to. But once they jump back in to that religious space that they left, then they start to get haunted by the accusations he knows all of them would be saying if he was honest.
Sure.
And
I get that.
Okay, I thought you might, because I That's not been I haven't had that. I mean, I've had the experience of knowing I should not say something because I don't want to be harassed,
Right.
but not thought, oh, well, what if they're right? Like I've not thought, well, what if there is eternal conscious torment?
Right.
That's not been
It's I would
existential.
it's there was an older woman. She's actually in her 80s. She's Episcopalian, and she's been Episcopalian for her whole adult life. But she grew up as a child in a very fundamentalist Christian home where it was completely a fear-based articulation of the gospel, air quotes, and so she's even though all of her adult life she has been in this very open, welcoming, loving space. But when she wakes up in the middle of the night and things are kind of tense and stressful for her, those old feelings come back from her childhood. And sometimes I do think, when we metabolize messages when we're younger, then they do have the power to creep back up sometimes, especially I think when we're tired or when we're particularly stressed out, and especially if we wake up in the middle of the night. Very rarely are our night thoughts comforting and happy ones. Um, and so just acknowledging, and then I think too acknowledging, okay, that doesn't mean that you're unhealthy. It doesn't mean that you have not truly opened up to a new understanding of the way the universe is, but recognizing that that's the power of messages metabolized at childhood. And so then we have to ask the question, what does genuine self-care look like? Uh,
Mhm.
what is our priority? Because
Yeah.
oftentimes we'll say, well, my guess is it's holidays, so it's probably back with family and back in that family system. And so and we just feel, well, of course I'm supposed to go. That's what you do with the holidays. You have to go be with family. And maybe that's true, or maybe not, or maybe it's a time away of just asking yourself, giving yourself permission to genuinely process what is authentically taking care of myself look like, to love myself and love these people. Because if you're in this environment and it's so profoundly triggering
Mhm.
that it throws you for a loop for the next 3 months, then it's worth asking the question, what is love, and what does it mean to actually care for myself in this way? Conversely, the good news is with this person already has their eyes open. They're already aware that they're going to be in this environment. It's going to be an uncomfortable environment, and they're going to be triggered by these judgments. Or even by the perceived judgments, because they
Yeah.
were in the environment. They know what they're thinking.
Mhm.
And so what does it look like then in those spaces? Even if you're going to go be with family, what does self-care look like? And giving yourself permission. It might mean getting away and going on a walk. It might mean carving out space where you're not around that environment. It might mean getting in touch with a good friend that can regularly talk with you and remind you of truth and sanity,
Mhm.
and kind of speak that beauty into the heart. And so the invitation is, okay, then how can you proactively take care of yourself? Don't just go into this thinking, okay, I've just got to slog through this morass and get through it until the other side, and then I can deal with it. But to actually go in with a plan of authentic self-care
Mhm.
to refill your tanks and be reminded of truth. Because you're right, it's kind of like if you just go sit in front of the news for 24 hours a day and you're bombarded by 90% of it, which is fear-based ridiculousness. I just think it's that old story that we've heard a million times, like that. Believe it comes from the Native American tradition of, and now there's memes everywhere on it. But this grandfather's talking to his child and says, with my child, within every person there's two wolves. One is good wolf, one is the bad wolf. The good wolf is love, compassion, mercy, forgiveness, kindness. The bad wolf is ego, fear, domination, greed, violence. And the kid asks, well, which wolf wins the battle? And the grandfather says to the kid, well, the one you feed. The one you feed. And that's
Mhm.
the reality, that we have both of these components in us biologically, I think, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. And the question is, which is going to win the battle? The one we feed. So if we immerse ourselves in fear-based environments or toxic environments that constantly are feeding the bad wolf, well, I think that's going to bubble out and over. But and if this, for this person, feels like kind of immersing themselves in an environment which will stoke a lot of those fear-based self-judgment, other judgment contexts, then it means, what can they do proactively to feed the good wolf? What can they do proactively to care for themselves in this environment? So I would just say that in spiritual practice, friends, walks, whatever, go away for a cup of tea, whatever it is that is going to be feeding for this person. I think going into it with a plan and proactive.
Mhm. So, here's something I've done, and then when in those situations invited people to do. You can judge it. You're a professional at this, Greg. But it's a very basic breathing meditation where you take a big deep breath through your nose, and as it comes in, you say, internally, God is. And then you sit there, knowing that you're acknowledging the source from which all things come and which all things return. And then whatever comes up that's running through your mind, and especially in anxious situations or fearful situations, it could be a claim about you. It could be a face of someone where you're, in some way projecting whatever judgments there or whatnot. And then you hold the breath until the things you aren't wanting to acknowledge come up. And then you exhale and you say love. So God is the source of all things, but also love. And if the same person or things keep coming up, it functions kind of like a kindness meditation, because the source of all, and I think part of the most compelling thing to me about the Christian vision is that the source of all is love. And that's true about the worst parts of ourselves and the things we don't like and love about ourselves, our neighbors and our enemies. Right. So, but doing that, I think can help reframe the stage of the interaction. Right. Like, so if you normally have your relationship with individuals framed by adversarial ways, then how do you ground that relationship in something that is both true and deeper? Right. So that the source of all is shared, and that the intention of the divine for you both is love in each moment. I found that to be helpful, like when you're in close contact, all of a sudden you're like, well, I have to go to the bathroom. So instead of tweeting when you're pretending to take a dump,
you can do some breathing. And that's, I think that's insightful too, because especially, what I find in particularly challenging or situations that are highly emotionally evocative in a challenging way, it has, sometimes we have our points in our day when things are pretty easy and it's kind of not too challenging to step off the hamster wheel and just kind of reflect in the moment. But I find that the more intense emotional the charges, the more profound the emotional magnetism and gravitational pull is, that it sucks you into autopilot in profound ways. And what you're describing, in fact, today at the end of our time, I'd love to do a particular breath practice. And there's actually been a lot of interesting research on it. And the nice one is it's very quiet, and you can actually do this breath practice when you're with people and no one knows you're doing it. But there's a lot of interesting research that shows, your sympathetic nervous system is kind of like your fire alarm, and your parasympathetic nervous system is like your fire extinguisher. And anytime we experience negative stimulation, from someone cutting us off to being in an environment with family that's particularly challenging, the sympathetic nervous system is activated, and so we just are kind of in this heightened state. And when we're in that state, if our body's braced and we're in that state, we're most likely going to be on autopilot in an unhelpful way, being pulled back into old patterns of operations that we grew up in. And sometimes what you're describing, there's a number, just spiritual practice is just an invitation that, again, is a stick in the spoke of functioning in autopilot, and invites us to interrupt that automatic narrative of that relationship. Is it adversarial, of our view of ourselves, of our view of the other? It creates a space. It's Viktor Frankl who says that, these practices, that in between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space lies your freedom. And for most people that have not done any kind of practice, there's very little gap between stimulus and response. It just is automatic. What spiritual practice, mindfulness, and meditation do is it widens that gap between stimulus and response. It enables us to, instead of be automatically reactive in our automatic functioning autopilot and narratives, it gives us a space to pause and respond from our true self, in Thomas Merton's language, instead of react. And so and the more that we practice, it's just like riding a bike or learning to tie your shoe or bake a souffle or anything else. The more you practice, the better you get at it. And what we're doing through practice is widening that gap that Viktor Frankl's talking about between stimulus and response, and widening our freedom. And that's true whether we're at work, whether we're at home in the holidays with a challenging family, whether we're just driving in the car and listening to the news, that there's this constantly cultivating a broadened space. So I would say what you're describing, that's breath practice, that is contemplative practice, that's heart-based practices. There's lots of things that we can do to actually grow in awareness of that space between stimulus and response.
Mhm. Yeah. The sometimes there's just enough gap between the two
I don't even know where you're going with this, but I'm interested.
for me to go, Tripp, here's what you shouldn't do right now.
Right.
And yet I remain a spectator to
Mm.
myself doing it.
Oh, that often. Sure.
And it happened consecutive days this week,
Mm.
to which I have this conversation with Alicia. She's like, what in the world, dude? Come on. You're just back to back to back. And I'm
Yeah.
like, I know what you're saying, but this time, what was actually going on through my head was, Tripp, don't be ridiculous.
Mm.
There's nothing, you don't need to take this personal. There is no judgment in what's going on. She's like, okay, well, given that that was not being voiced.
Right. Right.
I'm like, I know, but I feel like I was almost there.
Well, and then I mean, I love it though, and it's so true. But then you finally did reach that point, probably when your nervous system calmed down, that then you could have that conversation where then you are in the space of responding instead of reacting. So I do think there's an infinite opportunity for, it's again not beating ourselves up for when we react, but just knowing that there's an infinite amount of opportunities to engage in that practice. It's every moment in the present, and so we're gonna mess up. We're gonna be reactive. We're gonna be functioning on autopilot. There are times it's kind of like when I do contemplative practice. If I do centering prayer, I might find myself that I've been actually thinking thoughts for like 5 minutes. Like I haven't done my sacred word and let the thoughts pass by me like leaves in a stream. Like I've literally just been floating in my thoughts about bills or lunches or relationships, like for a whole 5 minutes. I didn't even know it. And then as soon as I'm aware of it, I'm like, man, this has been a long time. This is supposed to be my centering time. And it's been 5 minutes of me thinking thoughts. Then that's where Father Thomas Keating is just saying, at that moment, as soon as you become aware of your thoughts, you don't beat yourself up. You just say your sacred word again as lightly as if you're placing a feather on a ball of cotton. That it's all about gentleness and grace and patience. That we never experience freedom with a hammer. That it is through gentleness. And so even your awareness that for you and Alicia to be able to laugh about that and be like, well, I am growing because I didn't function totally on autopilot. There was a voice out there. My true self was voicing, it's not a good idea to continue on this trajectory. I didn't listen to it, but I did hear it. And then, that's just, that's kind of our growth trajectory, right? That's very human.
Yeah. Yes. All right. So here's the next question. So we don't turn this into Tripp's therapy session. But
so Tripp, tell me.
Yeah. There's a question about you briefly mentioned last time comments about the presence of God in relationship to prayer and thinking in a kind of a panentheistic context and such. And so one of the questions was, how does that vision of the God world relationship change the prayers of Advent that are the beckoning the coming of God? Right. So like throughout all the liturgies at the Episcopal Church each week, you get come.
Right. O come, Emmanuel.
Yeah. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Like there's tons of invocations that seem to assume, the way the question is like, how does the ubiquitous presence of God connect to the invocation or the calling upon the coming of God?
Sure. Yeah. And I think for a lot of years, I did not have a panentheistic perspective of that God is not, the question, is God everything? And panentheism is saying that God inhabits, is within all, in the entire universe, within every molecule, bursting, with divine presence. But for a long time, I had a view, and I remember this was when I was in seminary at Reformed Theological Seminary back in the late 90s, and this is when I was a conservative, Reformed, on training to be a pastor. And I remember I had a seminary professor say that prayer is our walkie-talkie to call in strikes on the devil, like in the devil's territory. And I remember, I was young at that time. I was probably in my mid-20s, and I kind of, part of me liked it just because it was kind of this, well, that sounds kind of badass. But then I also thought, this is messed up on so many levels. As I started to unpack that concept, that God's up there and we're down here, and the best we have is a walkie-talkie, predominantly in a war-based metaphor.
Yeah.
There's so much wrong with it. But I realized that it took a long time for me, even as I started intellectually opening up to the idea that in Paul's language to the philosophers in Athens, quoting their own poets, but he says that in God we live and move and have our being. And of course, that's the language of immersion and saturation. You could even say it's the language of marination, that we are immersed in divine presence. But it took me a while to realize that the issue is not that God's out there, and if we try and pray hard enough, that if the mass of prayers finally reaches God's tipping point of, okay, fine. Kind of like the dad, the kids are playing in the basement, the angry dad's upstairs in the Barco lounger, and either you're trying to get him to play, or but you're just if you do enough, you'll finally get the attention. And I think that is really dangerous and painful and even toxic theology. God clearly is, all things are held together, made through Christ, held together in Christ. And this idea of we are immersed. So I believe, in my perspective in Advent, is not that we're summoning or beckoning the presence of God, but and I believe in my definition of sin in Scripture, capital S, it's not our little naughty acts of behavior, but I would say that sin is the delusion of separation. And if we remember, and this is probably going too much, and Tripp, you can dance all around this and see where you want to go with this. But when we go back to the garden, the issue was, again, when they ate the fruit in the creation story, or in the garden narrative, that all of a sudden, they run and hide from God. So there's separation from God. The first thing that happens is that Adam throws Eve under the bus, and God says, God, the woman you made gave me the fruit and I ate. So throws Eve under the bus. So there's separation between humanity, and then the earth is, the soil is cursed. And so there's separation from creation and cosmos, but nothing externally actually changed. That when they ate the fruit, it was all an issue of their perception of reality. The garden hadn't changed at that time. It was their perception of their conscience, their view, their lens on life shifted to one of separation and fear, which I think is the brilliant wisdom of the biblical narrative. And I would say that the healing is that we're already immersed in divine presence. We're all intimately connected with one another and the cosmos, and that the work of salvation is a healing of sin, which is the healing of the delusion of the separation, of our eyes being open to our already existing connection. So when we're summoning God, O come, Emmanuel, it's not actually that God's far off and we're making God come near. In my theological perspective, we are asking in this space to have our delusion of separation healed and grow in awareness of our already existing connection.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my 2 cents. I'm curious what you would say.
Well, yeah. So I think the part of the language, the liturgical language in Advent that's picking up, the beckoning of the divine and the Psalms and the prophets, and then thinking about a lot of the imagery around the coming of Christ, is whether or not the coming of God is something where is the arrival of God an intervention, where the proper view of the world is a world without God, and then to say the response is the breaking of what would have happened and the arrival of something else. And I think that picture's problematic. And obviously this past week, I think the beautiful things in Dom's lecture was to go, no, that's exactly what John the Baptist thought. And Jesus had a conversion experience, right? To, Dom used the language of participatory or collaborative eschatology. There's this really, really good book, Greg, called Divine Self-Investment. It's an open and relational Christology.
Yeah, I've heard about the author.
Yeah, and there, the author, brilliant theologian, wonderful guy, good guy, very nice,
good egg.
said that underneath a lot of our thoughts around the coming, if we were to use that the framework in chapter 1, the open relational framework, is that God gives God's self every moment to the world.
Right.
The problem isn't the presence of God or
Right.
the gifting of the divine life, if you're using like theological language.
Yep.
The variable of arrival is our own participation, our own birthing of the coming of God within
I
us,
like
our
that.
own fidelity to the call, lure of God. So, and I don't think this is weird hippy dippy. I think it's like actually what Paul points to, right? So, what is it that Paul emphasizes that was about Christ? It was his fidelity to the Father all the way to the cross. And that is like this big affirmation. What does it lead to? The raising of the heir of David into the divine life, right? For Paul, the deification in a sense of Jesus is at the resurrection in Romans. In Philippians, what does Paul do? He says, let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who did what? What's faithful? Who is Jesus? He's the image of the invisible God. Why? Because he is faithful. He gives existence to divine insistence moment to moment. Without our participation, without our birthing, without our fidelity to the coming of God, God is only coming. But the variable is not whether or not God's decided to show up this moment.
Right.
It's whether or not those who bear the image decide to do so.
I really, you know what?
And anyway,
sorry, go ahead, man.
No. So that was a connection point, I think, to some of the distortion, right?
Right.
That gets picked up in the Genesis image, Genesis story, right? Like it wasn't like there was this giant metaphysical shift.
No,
it was, but the internalization of guilt and shame and these kinds of things lead to us to treat reality as if sin is the proper category.
Right.
And
I really like that. And so what I appreciate about that, and it actually is, it's kind of hand in glove and inseparable from what I was attempting to articulate in terms of this shift of a lens on life, out of fear, out of the delusion of separation, but that it's not just one of internally. You know, we talk a lot about there's the inward journey, the outward journey. And they're inseparable. In a lot of churches, you see that they're very distinct. If they have either, you've got your activists, your social activists, you've got your social justice folks, then you've got your contemplative group that just wants to do centering prayer and walk in the woods. But the two are, that's what I love about Richard Rohr's Center in Albuquerque. It's a center for action and contemplation. You know, those two are inseparable. And to me, if we as we're walking this and engaging in community, and it actually lands more than just in an intellectual system of doctrine, but actually lands in a way that's internally experienced, well, that's not going to leave us the same. It's going to inspire us to change the way that we participate. And the way we participate, I think, is even down to the previous illustration with you and Alicia, that the way you participate can be, sorry to just come back to your story again, but I think it's sometimes our examples of, you know, the advancement of the kingdom of God in terms of the Jesus's language of I believe this shift of lens on life, and it's going to be that we actually stop being reactive, we apologize, and then we open the space to reconnect, or we do the same. We apologize if we were yelling at our kid, or it can slow us down to actually just let someone merge in front of us in traffic instead of revving up, or it, you know, then it can also inspire us to, you know, boldly engage our world in different ways with our gifts. But but to not minimize that the way we participate as we grow and aware of this connection, it's not always super religious. It's not always, it's going to be primarily lived out in the mundane. And that's where we participate. But I really appreciate that.
You know, that leads to this other variable I think is helpful. And I actually have no idea if I get the questioner. I think you answered their question, nerdy wise. If you use the framework of participation, collaboration, or the fidelity, faithfulness, giving materiality to the divine insistence, then when you do the prayer, "Come, Lord Jesus, come," you reflect on the coming of God, the day of the Lord, all these different biblical imagery. You also have to ask yourself, what is the horizon of this prayer? And if the long version, there's 7, but you can group them in 3. One is the horizon of the self,
Yeah,
right? And
right.
that is the place where the active doing contemplative practice or any type of spiritual practice, part of what you're doing is recognizing that we each have limited agency in the world. We don't pick where we're thrown in the world. We can no longer change our past, just how we relate to it. It's all inherited every moment that we're inheriting it. What we get each moment is what we say, what we do, and how we ultimately respond
Yeah.
to what's being inherited and what's possible before us. And if we think about that prayer, the coming of God, then in what ways, moment to moment, can our own agency, as limited as it is, because
Yeah.
we can't change the past or what's actually possible, but we can gauge what we contribute to in each moment.
Yeah.
That is the first place that kind of this nested where we can take responsibility with our agency.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, every other group that we would like to pray, "Come, Lord Jesus, come," requires collaborative cooperation with other humans. So I'm sure you've had this experience, but your boys are older now, so it's probably it's not as triggering to mention. But sometimes as a parent, you already know what the lure of God is for them in a moment, namely to do what you want. Now, they may not experience it that way. And then all of a sudden, you're like, "No, this is what you're supposed to do, Elgin." And all of a sudden, you realize how powerless you are. And yet, if you think, like, my entire identity is attached to my relationship to this individual, be it a kid, a partner, a coworker, or same kind of thing happens with a community. How many of us wrestle with the ways we inherit kinds of privilege, recognize systemic injustices, and then get burnt out because our own agency is so limited at doing it. And then we feel like failures and impotent because we can't do what even God has refused to do, coerce other people in a community to doing what we want, right? And then we get overwhelmed, then we get nihilistic, then we disengage. And so there's these kind of scales of horizon that the individual is the place that where you have your own agency as a gift of grace moment to moment. Every other relationship and community, then you have to recognize where you are responsible for what you say and do, contribute, but you're only responsible to each other. And the moment you feel responsible for these people you're in community with, then you end up having the coming of God all of a sudden becomes your vocation. It's above your pay grade, but you feel it as a parent, as a partner, in a church community, especially if you're leading in a nation, anyway. And then the biggest one, though, I think, is the picture of Christmas for large portions of the church is that the gift of God coming, the infinite and the finite intermingling, was not something about just the person of Jesus, but a promise for the world's future. So part of that call of the coming of God is not even just different communities of people, but the whole of creation. And so I find realizing, like in nesting dolls, knowing what I'm responsible for and spending time getting better at that, actually, and that gap you discussed earlier, right? In that gap, then I can learn to differentiate. Am I responsible for this, or am I responsible to it? Because all that can be asked of you is to be faithful and contribute towards the well-being, justice of the whole. And sometimes you could be fully faithful and end up on a cross, right? So faithfulness does not equal success. But if the success of your kid or your family or your church or your nation or whatever gets that kind of, I don't know, but kind of a perverted turn, where all of a sudden you feel your own worth and value tied up in it, then it gets sick. And so those prayers, thinking about the coming of God, how does it come in the horizons, and then how do you show up in them? I find that's helpful framing.
That's really helpful. And I know that like all really good theology. It's easier said than done, in terms of
Oh yeah, that's why
genuinely.
you're going to figure out how to do it. I just
No, but
laying it out
that's
there.
brilliant. I mean, and again, just in my own story, when I planted a church back in like 2001, by 2010, it was my first church. The church was my identity. Like, I didn't want it to be, but like it was, it would ebb and flow based on numbers of people attending, based on responses to sermon, based on impact in community, and it was just ephemeral enough to keep me in a constant anxious state. But it got to the point when any new person was coming to church, which of course you want new people to come, but when a new person would come to church, it would make me nauseous, because it would make me feel like this is one more person I've got to impress and take care of, and it was like it was all on me. I had in my delusion of kind of this, unaware of Messiah complex, taken this burden of all of these people, and it completely fried me. I had to quit that church, and I was going to quit ministry altogether, because I didn't know how to operate in exactly what you're describing. I started to have to begin to walk this journey, and I still find after all these years, I've been in full-time ministry now for like 28 years. And especially in the Southeast, in the Bible Belt, where there's a real temptation to place pastors on a pedestal. And the more you try to get off the pedestal by showing your vulnerability, the more calcified the pedestal becomes, I find. But it's really challenging as we begin to think all of these things are, we begin to present, we begin to take people's responsibility for things that we have no power to impact. And it creates incredible existential anxiety and dread versus, and what you're, even as you were talking, it just, to me, I felt a beautiful invitation of allowing ourselves to be genuinely human, just to be genuinely our gorgeous, healthy, neurotic, messy, strong selves, and just allowing ourselves to be ourselves and then move through the world. I think if we were able to genuinely metabolize what you were just describing, it would be so liberating. I mean, so utterly liberating in how we love and transform and heal the world and our own families, our own systems, even when we're at the grocery store. I mean, I just think it's a gorgeous framework.
All right. Okay. We have one more question, and then we can do a practice. And this one, there are a couple of people asked something along this, and I made a list of 7 responses. I thought I'd try to say them in 30 seconds, and then you tell me
good. I like it.
So the questions were all around okay, well, I get what Dom's talking about in the scripture stuff and all theological parables and all this kind of thing. What in the world do you make of like the doctrine of the Incarnation if you thought it was always tied to magic conception and that kind of thing? And I responded to the first 2 people, and I was like, actually, there's a bunch of answers to this questions Christians have been saying for a long time, some newer, older, and all that kind of stuff. I was like, I realize you're like, you only thought there was this, oh, if 2 believe it, I have to argue some magic thing happened on Enlightenment terms of a naive reading of a biblical text, which then I realized that sounded mean. But so I came up with 7 different things that Christians have said for a long time about the Incarnation. And any of these, if they're exciting, it could be yours, and then you don't have to worry about whether your interpretation of it, like, there's no biology required. Well, short of like bearing the divine image, but you know what I mean.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can't wait to
All
hear
right,
these.
so I think I ordered them in semi. They get higher Christologically.
Of course you did.
Over time. But I don't really know because I wrote it on a notepad and now. Okay, so the first one could be the Incarnation is the way the church affirms the particular life of Jesus as a guide, or a guide to life's wisdom and the invitation to a life of practice in the divine presence. That is, and so the image of God is both an image of what it means to be human and of the face of God. There's no weirdness there. We could go through quite a few of the early church fathers to say something basically like that. All right, next level up, you take that and then you go, yes, but the person of Jesus is a symbol or a sacrament of God. And that means that the what Jesus said, did, and endured is a symbol of God to humans, that this is what the divine reality pulses with this love, and humans to God. This is what humanity turned on in its fullness looks like. And the affirmation of the incarnation is that Jesus is the symbol of deep reality to humanity and its dignity, and human dignity alive in response to the gift of life.
Mm-hmm.
No magic needed.
Nice.
And then there's always fun discussions of symbols. Some get to you could say that the life ministry of Jesus and fidelity to the cross images the divine. And there, the incarnation is a theological statement about Jesus's fidelity to the one he calls Abba throughout his life. What does finitude, taking the call of the infinite seriously, or if we use some of the language Dom is using, like the image of could be a metaphor of deep reality over against the logic of the domination system. And so there, the affirmation of the incarnation is a faith statement that the grain of the universe is revealed in Jesus's fidelity to the kingdom of God. Oh, no magic needed. Also compelling, and it could inspire you even if you are in another religious tradition, like say like Gandhi or something. You could go incarnational and say that Jesus is the affirmation of the incarnation is an affirmation of the potential for humanity, something we resist every moment and in every age. And by attending to the potential for that all human beings have in the way it was expressed beautifully in the person of Jesus, it functions as an invitation to faithful living. And that is at the very heart of the church. You could say the incarnation is the gift of theosis. The divine gift of God's self takes root or recognition. See, they're different metaphysical statements in the person of Jesus. And by affirming the incarnation, you're affirming the potential for the divine to be birthed in yourself, in your neighbor, and in your enemy. The other two are the incarnation functions as a revelation of reality. And that would connect to some of the language of that you were talking earlier about, the way we misread parts of Genesis. So the incarnation is a revelation that the story we've been telling ourselves from our brokenness, shame, and woundedness is a lie, and this is what lies at the heart of reality. Or it can be a revelation of the future. And you can actually say both of those depending on the way you get at it. But all of those are things that I can think of an early church father who said it, and contemporary theologians who have like the updated way you appreciate the intuitions of the early church in light of contemporary science, historical criticism, and such. So we're more than welcome to pick those up later. I really appreciate that. I just feel like it is real annoying to me that we have like loud, obnoxious theologians who act as if whatever their preferential answer is from their tradition is like gatekeeping Christianity.
Oh yeah.
It was like Dom's response, when someone, what do you do if, how does a heretic from the Jesus seminar celebrate Christmas? And Dom was kind of irritated. He's like, why am I going to let them tell me? He's like, I got all the different Christmas symbols out when it gets to Christmas. He's already told us, he's like, well, my favorite Advent hymns are the ones in Latin. And if I have to do one in English, you start going through it. And it's you just imagine if you had like the video camera running in his house versus the people complaining about him house. He's like, who makes slide presentations to celebrate the way the church at different points in history have wrestled with the biblical text well.
Right.
And then you're like, yeah, I don't think this is important to you. You're a deep heretic. Right. So there's all these beautiful ways the church does. And underneath it, I think here's the affirmation I find that practice helps. You can go, okay, these other thinkers and other cultures, situations, parts of history give me language that resonate with me now. But I think we also have to give permission to go, whatever was necessary for you to encounter the God mediated by Jesus, which I think is a kind of a minimal claim for people that use the label Christian. it obviously is true if you've had the experience, right? So like, I just know so many people are like, well, I used to think this. Now I don't know about that. Like, is this whole thing a sham? And then I'm like, tell me about the most beautiful experiences in your life.
Mm-hmm.
And then they like talk about times where the grace of the divine shifted their relationship to someone that hurt them, or they recognized a deep reservoir of infinite love and holding their child, or all they start naming these things. And I'm like, all right, so I just want to hear me out. Whatever had to be true in any of the questions you're losing sleep about obviously is if you're having those experiences. So just guess what God not losing sleep over.
That's
what
so
you
good.
happen to think this moment, and probably not over the next moment, but what is hurtful for, I think, or becomes burdensome is for you to ultimately cut yourself off from those moments of deep encounter with the divine because you think they're only legitimated by shitty ideas you left behind.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's I mean, I think that's classically where so much wounding comes from in the church, is that, especially more conservative environments where we have shrunk the definition of what the gospel is down to something so specific. And it's, you've heard this before. Someone said, "I don't believe in God," and it's always interesting to ask them, "Well, tell me about the God you don't believe in." Or tell me about the doctrine you don't believe in, and you begin what you just did by just listing out and describing those 7 rich perspectives, is just recognizing there's so many. And one of the greatest freedoms that we can have is realizing that it's not trying to figure out the thing, and that's part of my recovery still from conservative faith, is that I approach the Bible as a constitutional scholar for chapter and verse to figure out, does God like smooth or chunky peanut butter? It was down to the specific thing of God's opinion on everything.
Skippy
And chunky. And so, but I really do believe that liberation, freedom from that delusion that that the right answer is a tightrope versus a wide open green field that we get to explore, and really experience. So thank you for that, Tripp. I that really resonated.
You mentioning your Reformed theological education. If you were there and that professor that talked about prayer being calling in spiritual intervention against demons, like if that professor was on this podcast and we were transitioning to our contemplative time, like if I said, what was his name?
Oh, what was his name? I can't remember his name.
We'll call him John Calvin. Professor Calvin, could you tell me about prayer? I think he would be like, yes. Yes, it's war.
I was wondering where you were going with
intervention.
You were just waiting for that sound effect. I should have noticed because you started looking at the buttons.
I thought about doing it when you were telling the story, but then I was like, no, I bet this is going to get emotional and vulnerable in a second, and then he'll be derailed by me hitting.
No, I don't know. That was solid. Still well played. And I know we've got limited time, but the nice part about this practice is it's brief. And this is seriously, this is such a good tool in the toolbox. But don't hit that button again while we're in practice, or the air horn. Just
I'm not air horn.
Just maybe set this mood with a little bit of an air horn. If it's your choice. Now let's all close our eyes. And so this is a practice. This is a breath practice. And as you were talking about, breath prayer was very common, especially in the early church. The Desert Fathers and Mothers would often teach breath prayer. Inhale one word, exhale another. And so understanding, or even just in the Hebrew scriptures, where the word for Holy Spirit is ruach, which literally means breath, that there's so much breath within. We in the West have become so disembodied, but there's a lot of rich science on this. This is a simple practice. It's a nose breath. And once you have this practice in your toolbox, like this is so helpful if you wake up in the middle of the night and can't go back to sleep, or you're in a stressful situation, or you're just at your 8th red light in a row, or if you're in the middle of a meeting and it's stressful, no one knows you're doing this. But there's a lot of interesting science on it. If you want to Google it, it's called Coherence breath. But it's just a simple nose breath, and you inhale for 5 seconds through your nose and exhale for 5 seconds through your nose with no pause at the top or no pause at the bottom. It's a really simple breath practice. And so we'll just, if it's okay, I'll just lead us in it just in our last couple minutes together. But go ahead and get comfortable if you're watching or listening, and You can do this if you're just walking along too, but sometimes it helps to be a little more distraction free, but allow your body to be both alert and at ease at the same time. Let's begin by bringing your awareness to your breath, to your breathing. And maybe as you do, allow your breath to drop a little more deeply into the bottom of your belly and rise up a little taller in your chest. And I'm just going to count some and guide us into this particular breath pattern of inhaling for 5 seconds with no pause at the top and exhaling for 5 seconds with no pause at the bottom. So inhale, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now allow your breathing to return to your normal pattern. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. So that was only about a minute and a half. If you, especially if you try that for, if some of the studies have been up, especially the impact of 20 minutes of that particular breathing, what it does to the your nervous system, again, shifting us from the parasympathetic to the from the sympathetic to the parasympathetic. But that one is a gem. If you are stressed, if you're feeling anxious, that one begins to really shift. And sometimes I use my spiritual practices, like I create a unique little flotilla. Like I'll do that breathing before I do centering prayer. It helps my body become my ally instead of all wiggly. So anyway, there's just ways to do this in all sorts of creative ways. But I know that we're at the end of our time, but I would definitely take that practice and play around with it. It's a good one.
All right. Well, thank you, Greg. Thanks for hanging out. Thank you, all of you that joined live and later. Remember, you can send in questions
Please do. We'd
and
love it.
such for next week. You always send really cool ones, but it's been a blast.
Thanks,
and
y'all.
we'll see you all Thursday next week, but also on Monday for the session on the similarities and resonances between Matthew and Luke's Christmas stories. So the crescendo, and Dom and I talked about it after we got off last time. I'm excited. And so, yeah, anyway.